June 455 AD. The air over Rome, thick and heavy with the legacy of 1,000 triumphs and the ghosts of Caesars, trembles not with the clash of steel or the roar of siege engines, but with a deafening, unnatural silence. At the walls of the eternal city stands not a bellowing horde, but a disciplined Vandal fleet, anchored at Ostia, their silent presence weighing on the psyche more heavily than any battering ram. The gates of Rome, which for centuries inspired awe and symbolized the unshakable might of the empire, open not to an enemy's assault, but to an order from within. The creak of the massive hinges is like the groan of a dying age. From the opening emerges not a legion in shining armor, but a procession of clergymen led by the Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo I. His figure in white robes seems fragile against the Cyclopean walls, but he is the last authority remaining in a city paralyzed by terror. He walks toward a man whose name has already become a legend and a nightmare across the Mediterranean, Gaiseric, king of the Vandals and Alans. There is no battle, no heroic defense. There are only negotiations on the threshold of a doomed metropolis. In this moment, the central paradox of this story is born, a question that will echo through the ages. How did a barbarian chieftain from the Germanic forests bring a 1,000-year-old empire to its knees without unsheathing his sword in a decisive battle at its heart? How did he turn a potentially bloody siege into a business transaction? To understand how this lame strategist managed to achieve the unthinkable, one must realize that the final scene at the gates of Rome was not the beginning of a battle, but merely its epilogue, the last act in a multi-year drama where the war was waged on invisible fronts, in the economy, in politics, and in the souls of men. To grasp the genius of Gaiseric, one must first look at the world he intended to conquer, the gigantic but internally rotten chessboard that the Western Roman Empire had become by the mid-5th century. This was no longer the monolithic power of Trajan or Augustus. It was a colossus with feet of clay, its limbs afflicted with gangrene and its mind clouded by agony. Officially, the empire still stretched from Britain to Africa, but in reality, its power was illusory. Gaul was torn between federated Goths and Franks. Spain was effectively lost and divided between Suebi and Vandals, and Italy itself was under constant threat of invasion. The emperors in Ravenna were no longer generals and statesmen, but puppets in the hands of barbarian warlords like the powerful Aetius, the last of the Romans, who was himself half barbarian by birth and methods. Power was held not by the authority of law, but by a fragile balance of betrayals and temporary alliances. The economy lay in ruins. The burden of taxes had ruined small landowners, driving them into debt bondage to magnates whose villas had become self-sufficient fortresses, independent of central authority. The army, once the pride of Rome, was now a rabble of barbarian mercenaries whose loyalty was bought with gold and just as easily sold. But the deepest rift ran through the souls of the people. Endless theological disputes between Orthodox Nicene Christians and the Arians, to whom many Germanic tribes, including the Vandals, adhered, had turned into a veritable Cold War, undermining the unity of society. In this world of chaos, where the old gods were dead and the new god had become a subject of fierce contention, where the very concept of being a Roman had lost its meaning, figures like Gaiseric are born. He was a product of this era of decay, but unlike others, he saw opportunity, not tragedy, in the rot. He understood that the giant mechanism of the empire had failed, and to defeat it, one did not need to break its gears in a frontal assault. One only needed to find the key lever and press it at the right moment. Gaiseric's very origin, like a seed, already contained his entire future destiny, the destiny of an outsider, forced to carve his own path not by noble blood, but solely by the strength of his mind and will. He was born around the year 389, the illegitimate son of the Vandal Asting king Godegisel and a slave woman. In the hierarchical and brutal world of the Germanic tribes, such a status was a brand, a constant reminder of his inferiority. He could not claim power by right of birth. He had to earn it, prove it, wrest it from fate. This circumstance stripped him of illusions from childhood and taught him to rely only on himself. To this social flaw was added a physical one. As ancient historians report, in his youth, Gaiseric fell from a horse and was left with a limp for life. In a culture where martial prowess and physical strength were the primary measures of a man, a limp could have been a death sentence. But for Gaiseric, it became his secret weapon. He could not be the fastest or strongest warrior in the warband, so he had to become the smartest. His limp forced him to think several steps ahead, to calculate risks, to avoid direct confrontation where cunning could win. He observed, analyzed, and remembered. He watched as his people, the Vandals, wandered across Europe under pressure from the Huns, crossed the frozen Rhine in 406, swept through Gaul with fire and sword, and finally settled in Spain. He saw how they fought and how they died, and he learned from their mistakes, transforming his personal pain and humiliation into a cold, calculating energy that would one day allow him to lead an entire nation. His illegitimate birth gave him boundless ambition, and his limp gave him a brilliant, strategic mind. It was this combination, the fury of the outcast and the patience of the strategist, that created the unique leader who could see in the chaos of the 5th century not a threat, but the greatest opportunity. History always weaves a tapestry of myths and legends around figures of Gaiseric's stature, attempting to find supernatural explanations for their incredible achievements. And the central myth in the Vandal king's biography became the story of his fall from a horse, which transformed from a simple accident into a prophetic sign. The chronicles, particularly Jordanes, convey this legend not as evidence of a physical defect, but as an act of divine intervention, a kind of initiation. It was said that at the moment of the fall, when the bone in his leg broke, Gaiseric had a vision or an inner revelation. Fate, as it were, was telling him, "Your path will not be straight and easy like that of other chieftains, who rely on the strength of their legs and the speed of their horses. Your path will be winding, full of falls, but each fall will make you wiser and stronger." His limp became a symbol of his special destiny. He was to lead his people not in a swift cavalry charge, but in a long, deliberate march, where the main weapon was not the spear, but the mind. Moreover, another legend was associated with this incident. It was supposedly then that it was prophesied he would lead his people across the sea to a promised land, to the Garden of Africa. For a Germanic tribe accustomed to forests and rivers, the very idea of crossing the sea seemed like madness. It was alien to their nature, their mythology, their art of war. But this prophecy, real or imagined, became part of Gaiseric's personal myth. He turned his flaw into a sign of chosenness and a mad idea into a sacred mission. Later, when persuading his warriors to build a fleet and leave Spain for the uncertainty of Africa, he would appeal to this divine predestination. Thus, the legend of the broken bone became a powerful propaganda tool, justifying his most daring and unorthodox decisions and creating around him an aura of a man guided by fate itself. Before becoming a conquering king, Gaiseric went through the harsh school of war on Spanish soil, which became a true crucible for him and his people. Arriving in Spain in the early 5th century, the Vandals and their allies, the Alans, found themselves in a boiling cauldron of incessant conflicts. This land was not a defenseless province. It was an arena where every city and every inch of land had to be fought for to the death. Their enemies were not only the Roman garrisons still trying to maintain control over the coastal cities, but also other barbarian peoples, particularly the powerful Visigoths, whom Rome used as foederats to fight against other invaders. It was here, in decades of grueling campaigns, that Gaiseric honed his military skills. He did not just fight. He learned. He observed Roman discipline, their ability to build fortified camps, their logistics and supply systems. He understood that the strength of the Romans lay not only in their legions, but also in their ability to control communications, roads, and especially seaports. He saw how the Visigoths, having adopted many Roman tactics, successfully pushed back his tribesmen. This experience taught him the main rule of survival and victory in this new world. You must take the best from the enemy and turn it against them. He realized that the blind fury of a berserker is good in a single skirmish, but to win a war, you need strategy, discipline, and most importantly, an understanding of the enemy's weaknesses. Spain became his military academy, where he studied his main enemy, Rome, not from books, but on the battlefield. He recognized that the empire, like a wounded beast, was still deadly in a direct confrontation, but its wounds, political and economic, made it vulnerable to one who could deliver a precise and unexpected blow to its most unprotected spot. He would remember this lesson for the rest of his life, and it would form the basis of his great African campaign. In the year 428, fate gave Gaiseric the chance he had been waiting for his entire life. His half-brother, King Gunderic, died during the siege of Seville. According to the laws of succession, power should have passed to Gunderic's sons, the legitimate heirs. But Gaiseric, who had spent decades building his authority among the warriors and honing his art of intrigue, had no intention of letting this opportunity slip away. Relying on loyal chieftains and using his eloquence, he essentially carried out a coup d'état. He convinced the nobility and the army that in these difficult times, with the Vandals trapped in Spain between the Romans and the Goths, the people needed not a young, inexperienced heir, but a battle-hardened, wise, and decisive leader. He presented himself as the only one capable of saving them from annihilation and leading them to prosperity, and they believed him. The proclamation of Gaiseric as king of the Vandals and Alans, he united both peoples under his rule, was a turning point. His first speech in his new capacity, as described by historians, was a masterpiece of political rhetoric. He did not call for another plundering raid, nor did he promise easy loot. Instead, he painted a grand vision of the future for his people. He spoke of creating their own independent kingdom, a land where they would not be nomads but masters, a dynasty that would rule for centuries. He offered them not just survival, but a historic mission. This moment, the seizure of power, reveals his true nature. He was not just a warrior, he was a statesman from the very beginning. His first blood as a ruler was shed not on the battlefield, but in the political struggle for the throne. And his first royal act was not a declaration of war, but the proclamation of a dream. He gave his people a purpose far greater than mere plunder, and it was this great goal, the acquisition of a kingdom, that fueled his conquests for the next 50 years. Behind Gaiseric's grand conquests and political intrigues lay a deep, personal, and all-consuming motivation that was far more complex than a simple thirst for gold or power. His inner demon, his driving force, was a furious hunger for legitimacy, a desire to erase the stigma of a bastard and prove to the world, and above all, to himself, that he, the lame outcast, was worthy of founding a dynasty that would stand equal to the Roman emperors. Every step he took was dictated by this ultimate goal. He did not want to be just another barbarian chieftain whose name history would remember only by the number of cities he burned. He wanted to build. His decision to lead his people to Africa was not an act of desperation, but a brilliant strategic plan to create his own state. With fertile land, rich cities, ports, and most importantly, secure borders. He did not destroy the Roman administrative system in conquered Carthage. He adapted it to his needs, forcing Roman officials to work for him. He minted his own coins, imitating Roman designs, but with the profile of his son, a clear sign of his claim to equality with the emperors. He understood that true power is not only military strength, but also symbolic capital. That is why he so persistently sought the marriage of his son, Gaiseric, to the daughter of Emperor Valentinian III in Eudocia. This marriage was meant to infuse imperial blood into the veins of his descendants, legitimizing his dynasty in the eyes of the entire civilized world. The sack of Rome in 455 was, for him, not so much an act of profit as an act of symbolic triumph. By taking the imperial regalia and the imperial family itself, he was, in a way, appropriating the legitimacy of the fallen empire. His entire life was a fierce struggle for recognition. He wanted his kingdom to be seen not as a barbarian camp, but as an equal power that even Rome had to reckon with. This secret, deep-seated ambition transformed him from a mere plunderer into an architect of a new political reality. Realizing that the key to dominating Rome lay not on land, but at sea, Gaiseric made a decision that seemed like utter madness to his contemporaries and forever changed the rules of the game in the Mediterranean. He decided to transform his land-based Germanic people, the Vandals, whose ancestors had wandered the forests and steppes of Central Europe for centuries, into a nation of seafarers. This was a strategic move of unimaginable audacity and genius. Gaiseric understood what other barbarian leaders did not. You could defeat Roman legions in Gaul or Spain as much as you wanted, but as long as Rome controlled the sea, it could transport troops, bring in supplies, and maintain connections with its wealthiest provinces, like Africa and Egypt. The Mediterranean Sea was the lifeblood of the empire, and Gaiseric decided to sever this artery. The process of creating a fleet was a miracle of organization and will. Having established themselves in Spain, the Vandals captured port cities like New Carthage, Cartagena, and the Balearic Islands. Gaiseric did not destroy the shipyards. He made them work for him with doubled intensity. He forced local Hispano-Roman shipwrights and sailors to build ships for him and to train his warriors in seamanship. His Vandals, who may have never seen salt water before, learned to set sails, work the oars, and board enemy vessels, either under threat of death or by the will of their charismatic leader. He turned his army into a force of marines, capable of fighting just as effectively on the deck of a ship as on land. This was the creation of a weapon for which Rome was completely unprepared. In the Roman mind, barbarians were a land threat, a cavalry avalanche. For centuries, they had built their defensive systems, the limes and walls, against threats from the land. The idea that Germans could challenge them at sea, in their mare nostrum, our sea, seemed absurd. It was this very absurdity that became the key to Gaiseric's success. He created an asymmetrical threat against which the aging empire had neither a strategy nor an effective countermeasure. In the year 429, just 1 year after coming to power, Gaiseric made his most daring and fateful move, one that would predetermine the fall of Rome for decades to come. Gathering his entire people, some 80,000 individuals, including warriors, the elderly, women, and children. He made an unprecedented leap across the Strait of Gibraltar, from Spain to North Africa. This was not merely a military expedition, it was the migration of an entire nation, an all-or-nothing gamble, a burning of all bridges. The formal pretext for the invasion was an invitation from the Roman governor of Africa himself, Count Bonifacius. This talented general had become embroiled in intrigues at the imperial court in Ravenna, where he was slandered and effectively sentenced to death by the regent Galla Placidia, instigated by his rival Aetius. Fearing for his life, Bonifacius, according to some historians like Procopius of Caesarea, made a fatal mistake. He invited Gaiseric to Africa as an ally, promising him a part of the province in exchange for military support. Gaiseric, of course, gladly seized this pretext. He gained a legal basis for the crossing and the opportunity to land unopposed. However, as soon as his foot touched African soil, he immediately broke all agreements. He had no intention of being someone's mercenary or junior partner. He had come to take everything. For the Vandals, this was an exodus to the promised land. Africa was the wealthiest province of the Western Empire, its breadbasket, supplying the grain without which Rome could not survive. The capture of Africa meant not just acquiring new territory, it meant gaining economic control over Italy itself. Gaiseric, unlike Bonifacius, thought not in terms of personal grievances and court intrigues, but in terms of eternity. He saw that whoever controlled African grain and olive oil held Rome by the throat. This leap across Gibraltar was an act of strategic genius that moved the war to an entirely new field, where Rome had no chance of victory. The Vandals' march across North Africa was swift and ruthless. The Roman provinces, which had not known war on their territory for centuries, found themselves completely defenseless against this new, mobile, and brutal force. Cities fell one after another. The culmination of this first stage of conquest was the siege of the major port city of Hippo Regius, modern-day Annaba in Algeria, in the year 430. This 14-month siege has gone down in history, not only for its military significance, but also for its profound symbolism. It was in the besieged city of Hippo that one of the greatest minds of late antiquity, the Church Father, Bishop Aurelius Augustine, resided. The author of the monumental work, The City of God, in which he contrasted the eternal heavenly city with the transient earthly kingdoms, found himself witnessing the collapse of the very earthly city he knew. For Augustine and his flock, it was an apocalypse made real. They watched as the world that had seemed unshakable crumbled under the onslaught of the barbarians, whom they considered not just enemies, but Arian heretics, messengers of the devil. Augustine died in the 3rd month of the siege, never seeing the fall of his city, but his death amidst this chaos became a powerful symbol of the end of an era. It was a clash of two worlds. The world of sophisticated theology, philosophy, and Roman order, personified by Augustine, and the new world of barbaric, pragmatic force, carried by Gaiseric. The Vandal victory at Hippo was not just a military victory. It marked the birth of a new legend. The name Gaiseric was now associated not just with plunder, but with a force capable of shattering the very foundations of Roman civilization. He showed the entire world that nothing was sacred and inviolable. Augustine's death against the backdrop of the fires of Hippo became a requiem for a passing world and a prologue to a new, brutal era, the master of which was now the king of the Vandals. Gaiseric's success in Africa would have been impossible without his ability to masterfully play on the contradictions within the Roman elite itself. During that period, the political stage of the Western Empire was dominated by two titanic figures: Flavius Aetius, the commander-in-chief of all imperial forces, and Bonifacius, the count, governor of Africa. Both were talented generals, the last defenders of a crumbling state, but their deadly rivalry and struggle for influence at the imperial court in Ravenna blinded them and ultimately led the empire to disaster. Gaiseric, like a brilliant grandmaster, used their mutual hatred to his advantage. Initially, it was Aetius's intrigues, which slandered Bonifacius before the regent Galla Placidia, that forced the latter to seek an alliance with the Vandals. Gaiseric acted as Bonifacius's ally, but as soon as he established himself in Africa, he betrayed him, beginning to conquer the province for himself. By the time the Roman court realized its mistake and reconciled with Bonifacius, sending him with troops against the Vandals, it was too late. Gaiseric defeated their combined forces. Upon returning to Italy, Bonifacius engaged in a final battle with his sworn enemy Aetius and, although victorious, suffered a mortal wound and soon died. This left Aetius as the sole ruler, but with the unresolved African problem. Aetius, preoccupied with fighting Attila's Huns in Europe, was forced to negotiate with Gaiseric, making humiliating treaties with him and effectively recognizing his conquests. Thus, Gaiseric constantly maneuvered between the two Roman titans, at times allying with one against the other, at others accepting gifts from both. He understood perfectly that while the last great Romans were destroying each other in a power struggle, he could calmly build his kingdom on the ruins of their empire. His diplomacy was as powerful a weapon as his army. He turned Rome's internal conflict into his main strategic asset. 10 years after landing in Africa, in the year 439, Gaiseric delivered a blow that finally transformed him from a mere invader into the master of Rome's destiny. He captured Carthage, the second largest and most important city of the Western Roman Empire, the Pearl of North Africa, the provincial capital, and the main port from which life-sustaining grain was shipped to Rome. And once again, as throughout his entire career, this triumph was achieved not by brute force, but by brilliant cunning. Gaiseric did not exhaust his army with a long and bloody siege of Carthage's mighty walls. He waited for a moment when the defenders' vigilance had weakened. As Prosper of Aquitaine testifies, the Vandals burst into the city on a day of major chariot races at the Hippodrome, when a significant part of the population and garrison was engrossed in the spectacle. The attack was so sudden that the city was taken almost without a fight. This moment became the point of no return in the history of Rome's fall. The capture of Carthage was not just the loss of another city. Firstly, it was a devastating blow to the economy. Gaiseric now controlled the supply of grain, the annona, to Rome. He could, at his discretion, cause famine in the Eternal City, giving him a powerful lever of political pressure. Secondly, along with Carthage, he captured the huge Roman fleet docked in its harbor, together with the shipyards and arsenals. His own naval power grew manifold, and he now became the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Thirdly, it was a colossal blow to the empire's prestige. Carthage, once Rome's sworn enemy, destroyed and rebuilt by the Romans, was a symbol of their power. Its fall into the hands of barbarians was an indelible disgrace. From that day on, Rome ceased to be the master of its own sea. It became a hostage, whose life and well-being depended entirely on the will of a barbarian king who had set up his lair in the ancient city of Hannibal. After the capture of Carthage and the humiliating peace treaty of 442 for Rome, which officially recognized the existence of the independent kingdom of the Vandals and Alans, Gaiseric reached the zenith of his power. He had journeyed from a lame bastard to a legitimate monarch, one of the most influential rulers of the world at that time. His court in Carthage rivaled the imperial court in Ravenna in luxury. He controlled the richest lands of North Africa, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearic Islands. But the main instrument of his power was his fleet. Having transformed from a land-based tribe into sea raiders, the Vandals under his leadership became a true curse of the Mediterranean. Their swift ships carried out daring raids on the coasts of Sicily, southern Italy, Greece, and even reached the shores of Asia Minor. They plundered merchant ships, destroyed ports, and took thousands into slavery. Gaiseric had, in essence, created the first major pirate state in history, which lived off plunder and control of sea lanes. The historian Priscus of Panium recounts a famous anecdote. When one of the helmsmen asked which course to set, Gaiseric replied, "Against those with whom God is angry." This phrase perfectly reflects his position at the time. He felt himself to be an instrument of divine retribution, or at the very least, a master of fate. He was the shadow emperor of the sea, a force to be reckoned with by all. It was at this moment, at the peak of his power, that Gaiseric could have fallen into what the ancient Greeks called hubris, pride that challenges the gods and fate. He did not just rule, he savored the humiliation of Rome, slowly tightening the noose around its neck, waiting only for the right pretext to deliver the final, devastating blow to his old enemy. His kingdom in Africa became an unhealing wound for Rome, one that constantly bled, draining the last strength of the once great empire. In the mid-450s, while Gaiseric was consolidating his kingdom in Africa, a tragedy unfolded on the political stage of Rome that became a gift of fate for him and a harbinger of a great storm. On March 14, 455, on the Campus Martius in Rome, the emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Valentinian III, was assassinated. His killers were two former bodyguards of the great general Aetius, who were avenging the murder of their patron, executed on Valentinian's orders the previous year. However, behind the direct perpetrators stood the wealthy senator Petronius Maximus, who had orchestrated the conspiracy to seize the throne. This event was of colossal importance to Gaiseric for two reasons. Firstly, Valentinian III was the very emperor who had signed the peace treaty with him in 442. Part of this treaty was the betrothal between Gaiseric's son, Huneric, and Valentinian's daughter, Eudocia. This dynastic marriage was a lifelong ambition for Gaiseric, a way to legitimize his dynasty. The emperor's murder and the subsequent seizure of power by a usurper tore this sacred agreement apart. Now he had an absolutely legitimate reason, from his point of view, to intervene, to avenge the death of a relative and protect the rights of his son. Secondly, the assassination of Valentinian, and before that, Aetius, had decapitated the empire. There was neither a legitimate emperor nor an all-powerful commander-in-chief capable of organizing a defense. Power was seized by a universally hated usurper, which immediately plunged Rome into a vortex of political chaos. Gaiseric, like an experienced predator, smelled blood. He realized his hour had come. The harbingers of the storm gathered over Rome, and this storm bore his name. He began to prepare his fleet, knowing that this time his campaign against Rome would not be just a raid, but a punitive expedition with all the hallmarks of legality. The events that followed Valentinian's assassination unfolded with kaleidoscopic speed, and each one seemed tailor-made to justify Gaiseric's invasion. The usurper Petronius Maximus, having seized the throne, committed a fatal act to consolidate his shaky power, which became the last straw that broke the Vandal king's patience. He forced Valentinian's widow, Empress Licinia Eudoxia, to marry him. For Eudoxia, a proud member of the Theodosian dynasty, this was an unbearable humiliation, to become the wife of her husband's murderer. Furthermore, Maximus forced her daughter, Eudocia, who was betrothed to Gaiseric's son, to marry his own son. This move was a direct slap in the face to Gaiseric, an open breach of all previous agreements. And then, in a desperate situation, in a golden cage in Rome, Empress Eudoxia took an unprecedented step. As the historian John of Antioch reports, she sent a secret message to Carthage, begging Gaiseric to come and free her from the usurper's tyranny. She appealed to him as the defender of her dynastic rights and the avenger of her husband's blood. It is hard to imagine a more perfect scenario for Gaiseric. He was no longer just an aggressor, but a liberator, carrying out the will of the legitimate empress. His invasion took on the appearance of a legitimate intervention to restore justice. This cry from a desperate woman became his formal casus belli, the convenient pretext he had perhaps been waiting for more than a decade. He could now sail on Rome not as a barbarian plunderer, but as a defender of violated laws and family ties. History rarely provides conquerors with such a flawless moral and legal justification for aggression. Gaiseric immediately ordered his fleet to prepare to set sail. The fate of Rome was decided not on the battlefield, but in the secret chambers of the imperial palace. While Gaiseric's vast fleet, assembled from every corner of his maritime empire, was leaving the harbor of Carthage and setting course for the north, Rome was completely paralyzed, devouring itself from within. The Eternal City resembled a richly decorated but rotten ship, left without a captain or a rudder in the middle of a storm. The murder of Aetius, and then Valentinian, had created a power vacuum that the usurper Petronius Maximus could not fill. He was a wealthy senator, but he had neither authority in the army nor the love of the people. The senatorial aristocracy, which he himself represented, despised him as an upstart and a regicide. The plebs, deprived of bread and circuses due to the chaos in governance, were on the verge of revolt. The army, left without its legendary commander Aetius, was demoralized and scattered on various fronts. The few troops that remained in Italy consisted mainly of unreliable barbarian mercenaries who had no intention of dying for a hated usurper. An atmosphere of fear, distrust, and universal hatred reigned in Rome. It was every man for himself. In this situation, it was impossible to organize any effective defense. There was no single will, no leader capable of rallying people around him, and no resources. Gaiseric, who undoubtedly had his spies and informants in Rome, was well aware of this state of internal decay. He understood that his main ally was not his army, but the chaos reigning in the enemy's camp. He did not need to storm the walls of Rome. He just needed to wait for the city to collapse under the weight of its own sins and contradictions. Rome in 455 was the perfect victim, still majestic and formidable on the outside, but completely empty and defenseless on the inside. It was ready to fall into the hands of anyone who dared to take it, and Gaiseric was just such a man. When the news that the Vandal armada had entered the mouth of the Tiber and was landing troops at Ostia, the port of Rome, reached the Eternal City, it had the effect of a bombshell. But the reaction was not an angry call to arms or a feverish preparation for defense. but universal panic and chaos. The city, which had not seen an enemy at its gates for centuries, was psychologically unprepared for such an ordeal. The first to break was the usurper Petronius Maximus. Realizing that neither the army nor the people would defend him, he decided to flee. But as he tried to break through the frenzied crowd on horseback, he was recognized. The rage and fear of the citizens, who saw him as the main cause of their troubles, burst forth. They dragged him from his horse and literally tore him to pieces, and his remains were thrown into the Tiber. On May 31st, 455, Rome was left without an emperor, without a government, and without any military authority. The city plunged into complete anarchy. At this moment, it became finally clear that there would be no battle for Rome. Gaiseric had won without even approaching the city walls. His fleet, anchored at Ostia, was not so much an invasion army as an instrument of psychological pressure, a catalyst that accelerated the already inevitable process of internal collapse. Rome did not fall to the blows of the Vandals. It fell under the weight of its own fear and lack of will. The legendary Aurelian walls, capable of withstanding any siege, proved useless when there was no one to defend them, and more importantly, no reason to. Gaiseric, counting on precisely this effect, demonstrated his deep understanding of his enemy's psychology. He knew that the empire was so rotten from within that the mere rumor of his approach would be enough for its capital to capitulate. The relentless advance of his fleet to Ostia was the final move in a long game where he had checkmated Rome in advance. In the power vacuum that formed after the murder of Petronius Maximus, when Rome was gripped by anarchy and awaited an inevitable reckoning, the only force that retained any authority and organization stepped onto the stage of history: the Christian Church, led by Pope Leo I. This man, already known to history as Leo the Great, was not just a religious leader, but also a wise politician and a fearless diplomat. Just 3 years earlier, in 452, he had already performed a miracle. By going out to meet the hordes of Attila, he persuaded the Hunnic leader not to march on Rome. Now, he had to repeat this feat, but with a different, perhaps even more dangerous, opponent. Upon learning of the Vandals' approach, Leo, at the head of a procession of Roman clergy, left the city without any guards and went to Gaiseric's camp. This meeting at the gates of Rome became one of the most dramatic moments in the history of late antiquity. It was not a clash of two armies, but a duel of two worlds, two ideologies, two types of power. On one side was Gaiseric, the warrior king, the personification of brute material force, a pagan in spirit, though an Aryan by faith, who had come for gold and vengeance. On the other was Leo, the high priest, the representative of spiritual authority, armed only with the power of his words, the cross, and his faith in divine providence. Leo understood that he could not stop Gaiseric. He had no legions, no gold to buy him off. He could only try to negotiate, appealing to the barbarian king's pragmatism. He did not ask for the city to be spared from plunder. He knew that was impossible. He asked for something else: that the plunder not turn into a massacre, that the city not be set on fire, and that the inhabitants not be subjected to torture. This was Rome's last line of defense, and this line was not a stone wall, but the fragile figure of an old man in white robes. The negotiations between Pope Leo and Gaiseric are a classic example of how pragmatism and cold calculation can prevail over bloodlust and destruction. Why did Gaiseric, with Rome completely at his mercy, agree to the terms proposed by an unarmed bishop? The answer lies in the psychology and long-term strategy of the Vandal king himself. Firstly, Gaiseric was not a mad destroyer, but a calculating statesman. His goal was not a Pyrrhic victory over smoldering ruins, but the maximum extraction of profit. He understood perfectly well that a burned city would bring him no income, and a mass slaughter would only embitter the population and complicate the systematic collection of valuables. An organized, methodical plunder was far more profitable than a chaotic pogrom. Secondly, his main goal was not only material wealth, but also political trophies. He needed Empress Eudoxia and her daughters, especially Eudocia, his son's fiancée. They were the key to legitimizing his dynasty and a powerful tool in future diplomatic games with Constantinople. Killing these high-ranking hostages would have been the height of folly. Thirdly, Gaiseric, being an Arian, was still a Christian and perhaps had a certain respect for the status of the Pope, the head of the Western Church. An agreement with Leo allowed him to save face, presenting himself not as a wild barbarian, but as a civilized monarch who waged war according to certain rules and spared holy places. Thus, he agreed to the deal because it fully served his interests. He got everything he wanted: treasures, hostages, the glory of conquering Rome, without the unnecessary costs and bloodshed that could have complicated his triumph. The deal was struck. In exchange for the promise not to burn the city and not to kill its inhabitants, Pope Leo agreed that Rome would open its gates and be given over to be plundered for 2 weeks. It was a terrible price, but the only one that could save the city from complete destruction. On June 2nd, 455, the gates of Rome were opened, and the Vandals entered the city. Thus began 2 weeks that shook the ancient world and changed it forever. But what followed was not the wild slaughter and chaos usually associated with the capture of cities. It was a cold, methodical, and highly organized process of extracting all material and human resources. Gaiseric kept his word to Pope Leo. There were no mass murders, nor were there arsons. Instead, his men, divided into squads, began to systematically clean out the city, quarter by quarter, palace by palace, temple by temple. This was not a robbery, but rather the work of a liquidation commission. The Vandals took everything of any value. They emptied the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, carrying away all the furniture, tableware, works of art, and imperial regalia. They stripped the gilded bronze tiles from the roof of the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, the greatest sanctuary of ancient Rome. They did not spare the Christian churches either, taking all the gold and silver utensils they could find. The private homes of senators and wealthy citizens were also methodically plundered. This 2-week plunder dealt a blow to Rome from which it could never recover. The city's economy was completely destroyed, but Gaiseric did not just take gold. He drained Rome of its lifeblood. He acted like a smart corporate raider who does not destroy an asset, but extracts all its valuable components, leaving only an empty shell. It is this organization and methodical approach, this lack of senseless cruelty, that makes the Vandal sack of Rome such a unique and even more chilling event. It was not an outburst of barbarian fury, but a cold, calculated operation that demonstrated that the new master of the world operated by his own, far more effective rules. Among the countless treasures carried away by Gaiseric from Rome were those that possessed not so much material as colossal symbolic and spiritual value. The most significant of these trophies were the sacred relics from the temple in Jerusalem, captured by Emperor Titus in the year 70 AD after suppressing the Jewish revolt. Among them were the famous golden menorah, the 7-branched candelabrum, the table of showbread, and other ritual objects. For nearly 4 centuries, these treasures had been kept in Rome as the greatest symbol of its victory and world dominion. Their image was even carved on the Arch of Titus, which can still be seen in the Roman Forum today. By stealing these relics, Gaiseric was doing more than just plundering. He was committing an act of symbolic rewriting of history. He was not just humiliating Rome, he was appropriating its glory, showing the whole world that the era of Roman dominance was over and that he, the king of the Vandals, was now the heir to its greatness. This gesture was understood by everyone in the world at that time. If Rome had once conquered Judea and taken its sacred objects, now a barbarian from Carthage had conquered Rome itself and taken its greatest trophies. It was a clear demonstration of a shift in the world order. Every cart laden with treasures leaving Rome for the port of Ostia carried away not just gold, but a piece of the soul and myth of the eternal city. The theft of the menorah was perhaps the most powerful blow to Roman imperial pride. It was visual proof that their city was no longer the sacred and inviolable center of the world. Gaiseric understood the power of symbols as well as the power of swords, and this move was calculated to inflict not only material, but also the deepest moral damage on the enemy, from which they would never recover. Gaiseric was too clever to limit himself to plundering inanimate objects. He understood that Rome's greatest wealth was not gold and silver, but its people, their knowledge, skills, and abilities. Therefore, an integral part of his plan was the capture and transport to Carthage of a vast number of captives, who could be called the empire's human capital. Along with the ships laden with treasures, ships packed with thousands of Romans also set sail from Ostia. But this was not a random collection of prisoners. Gaiseric carried out a targeted selection. First and foremost, he was interested in skilled specialists: architects, engineers, doctors, weaponsmiths, shipwrights, jewelers, and other craftsmen whose knowledge was essential for building and strengthening his own kingdom in Africa. He essentially conducted a brain drain operation on an unprecedented scale. These people were now to work for the prosperity of Carthage, not Rome. Secondly, he took with him many members of the Roman aristocracy, senators, and their families. They were a valuable source of ransom and political hostages for him. But his main prize, of course, was the imperial family itself. Valentinian's widow, Empress Licinia Eudoxia, and her daughters, Placidia and Eudocia. He received them with all honors at his palace in Carthage. They were his ultimate trophy, living proof of his triumph. Soon, as planned, he married Eudocia to his son Huneric, fulfilling his long-held dream of a dynastic union. This great exodus not only enriched the Vandal kingdom, but also dealt another devastating blow to Rome. The city was deprived not only of its money, but also of its best minds and political elite. It was a financial and intellectual bloodletting that accelerated the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire. When the last Vandal ship disappeared over the horizon, Rome was left alone with its desecrated glory. The city was not burned, its walls and buildings still stood, but it was merely an empty shell, stripped of its substance and soul. The streets were full of people, but they were people who had suffered profound shock and humiliation. The myth of Rome's eternity and inviolability, which had been the bedrock of ancient civilization for 1,000 years, was shattered into dust. If the fall of Rome to Alaric's Goths in 410 had been seen as a terrible but isolated misfortune, now, after Gaiseric's sack, it was clear to everyone that this was a systemic collapse. The city had lost not just its treasures, it had lost its economic base. African grain would never again flow into its granaries in the same quantities. Political power had definitively shifted from the Senate and the imperial court to barbarian warlords, who would enthrone and depose puppet emperors for the next 20 years, until this fiction too came to an end in 476. The sack of Rome was the point of no return. It exposed the full depth of the imperial organism's decay and showed that it was no longer capable of protecting even its own heart. The spiritual breakdown was perhaps even more profound than the material one. The Romans lost faith in themselves, in their gods, or God, in their destiny. As one contemporary wrote, "The mother of the world was humbled, and no one came to her aid." This image of a violated mother perfectly conveys the state of devastation and despair that gripped Rome after the Vandals' departure. The city survived physically, but its spirit was broken forever, and it began its slow descent into the twilight of the early Middle Ages. Gaiseric's return to Carthage was the apotheosis of his life, a moment of absolute triumph. He returned not just with immense booty, he brought with him the living symbols of a vanquished empire. As his fleet entered the harbor of Carthage, the inhabitants saw not only ships laden to the brim with Roman gold and works of art, but also the Empress of Rome herself with her daughters. It was a spectacle meant to definitively establish in the minds of both the Vandals and the conquered Roman Africans who the true master of the world now was. Gaiseric had achieved what no barbarian chieftain before him, not even Alaric or Attila, could have dreamed of. He had not just plundered Rome, he had humiliated it, brought it to its knees, without losing a single warrior in battle at its walls. He sat in his palace in Carthage, the ancient capital of Rome's sworn enemy, Hannibal, and savored his victory. He married his son to a Roman princess, becoming related by marriage to the Theodosian dynasty. He controlled the destinies of senators and aristocrats. He commanded the sea lanes and could dictate his will to both Rome and Constantinople. He was on top of the world. This triumph cemented his status not just as a king, but as the founder of a mighty maritime empire. He had proven to his people that his audacious plan, which began with the migration to Africa, had been a stroke of genius. He had given them not just wealth, but a homeland and a sense of superiority over their former masters. In the eyes of his warriors, he was not just a leader. He was a prophet who had led them to the promised land and granted them dominion over the world. The triumph in Carthage was the culmination of his long journey from a lame bastard to the lord of the Mediterranean. It would seem that after such a crushing humiliation, Rome should have finally fallen. However, the empire's agony lasted for a few more years, and it even made one last desperate attempt to crush its main enemy. In the year 468, combining their efforts, the Western and Eastern Roman empires assembled, according to historians, one of the greatest armadas in the history of antiquity. More than 1,000 ships and 100,000 soldiers, under the command of the inept Byzantine general Basiliscus, were sent to the shores of Africa with a single goal: to destroy the Vandal kingdom and put an end to Gaiseric once and for all. This was the empire's final gamble, its swan song. Gaiseric, now nearly 80 years old, faced the most serious threat of his entire reign. But here, too, his genius as a strategist and a trickster did not fail him. He did not engage in an open naval battle with a superior enemy force. Instead, he began negotiations, asking Basiliscus for a 5-day truce, supposedly to prepare the terms of his surrender. The credulous Basiliscus agreed, and during the night, Gaiseric struck. He used fire ships, old vessels laden with flammable materials. Under the cover of darkness, these ship bombs, driven by a favorable wind, were sent directly into the midst of the crowded and carelessly anchored Roman fleet. The effect was catastrophic. Fire spread instantly from one ship to another. In the ensuing panic and chaos, the remnants of the Roman armada were attacked and destroyed by the main Vandal fleet. This was not just a victory, it was a complete rout. The Battle of Cape Bon was the final nail in the coffin of the Western Roman Empire. It lost its fleet, its army, and its last hopes of revival. Gaiseric once again proved his superiority, destroying the greatest threat with military cunning and an asymmetrical response. Now we can give a final answer to the main question posed in the title. How did Gaiseric bring Rome to its knees without a single battle at its walls? The solution to this paradox is that a decisive battle was unnecessary, because the entire war had been won by him long before his fleet appeared at the mouth of the Tiber. Gaiseric was the architect of a victory built on four fundamental pillars. The first pillar was economic warfare. By capturing North Africa, and particularly Carthage, he cut off the main artery that fed Rome, the grain supply. He gained the ability to starve the Eternal City, turning it from the capital of the world into a dependent hostage. The second pillar was an asymmetrical military strategy. By creating a powerful fleet, he moved the war to the sphere where Rome was most vulnerable, the sea. Instead of trying to storm land borders protected by legions, he terrorized the coasts and sea lanes, exhausting the empire and undermining its trade. The third pillar was a brilliant political game. He masterfully exploited the internal strife in Rome, the rivalry of generals, court intrigues, the struggle for the throne. He waited for the perfect moment when his enemy would be at its weakest and most demoralized. And that moment came with the assassination of Valentinian III and the ensuing chaos. Finally, the fourth and perhaps main pillar was psychological warfare. The very fact of his approach, his reputation as an invincible and cunning enemy, caused a paralysis of will and panic in Rome that led to the collapse of authority even before his arrival. Thus, Gaiseric's approach was comprehensive. He was not a primitive warrior relying on brute force. He was a systemic strategist who struck at all of the enemy's vulnerable points: its stomach, its wallet, its political system, and its mind. When he stood before the gates of Rome in 455, the city was already dead from within. All that was left for him to do was to certify its death and claim the inheritance. Fate, as if to emphasize the irony of this story, granted Gaiseric a long life and a peaceful death, a rare privilege for rulers of that turbulent era. He ruled his kingdom in Africa for almost half a century, outliving all his enemies and rivals. He witnessed the final fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. This fact has immense symbolic significance. The barbarian who dealt one of the most fatal blows to the empire outlived it. He died in his bed in Carthage in the year 477, at the age of about 88, passing power to his son Huneric and founding a dynasty that would rule in North Africa for over half a century more, until it was destroyed by the Byzantine general Belisarius. His end was remarkably undramatic against the backdrop of the fiery and bloody epoch he himself had largely created. Emperors died by the daggers of conspirators. Generals perished in battles. Cities turned to ash, while he, the lame king of the Vandals, considered a scourge of God and a destroyer, quietly faded away from old age in his capital. This peaceful death is the final touch to his paradoxical portrait. He, who lived his entire life in a state of war, turned out to be one of the most durable and stable rulers of his time. It was as if fate were mocking Rome. Its eternal empire perished in the agony of civil wars and invasions, while the seemingly ephemeral kingdom of the Vandals, created through violence and cunning, secured a long and peaceful old age for its founder. This underscores Gaiseric's main trait. He was not only a genius of destruction, but also an equally brilliant master of survival and state-building. Perhaps the greatest irony in Gaiseric's legacy is how history has remembered his people. The word vandalism today is synonymous with senseless, barbaric destruction of cultural property. However, as we have seen, the Vandal sack of Rome in 455 was anything but senseless destruction. It was a cold, calculated, and organized operation to seize assets, in which the physical destruction of the city and its monuments was minimized by Gaiseric's direct order. So where did this historical myth come from? It was born from the propaganda of Roman and Byzantine chroniclers, who sought to vilify their enemies, portraying them as savages and fiends. Church authors were particularly zealous, as they could not forgive Gaiseric not only for plundering churches, but also for his Arian faith and his persecution of Orthodox priests in his African kingdom. In their writings, the Vandals appear not just as enemies, but as enemies of the faith, godless destroyers. This image was adopted and solidified during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, when humanists, idealizing ancient Rome, sought culprits for its demise. The Vandals, with their cacophonous name, were a perfect fit for this role. Thus, a brilliant strategist and politician, whose main characteristic was cold calculation rather than blind fury, became a symbol of primitive barbarism in the memory of posterity. His true legacy was buried under a layer of hostile propaganda. In reality, his historical role is far more complex. He was not so much the gravedigger of Rome as one of the architects of the new medieval world that was born on the ruins of ancient civilization. He was one of the first barbarian kings to create a durable and independent state on the territory of the former empire, and his kingdom became a model for many other barbarian states that arose in Europe. So, bringing together all the threads of our narrative, we can give a final, multi-layered answer to the question of how the Vandal king brought eternal Rome to its knees without a single battle. Gaiseric was not just a barbarian who luckily seized a moment. He was a brilliant systems analyst of a decaying empire. Like a skilled physician, he gave Rome an accurate diagnosis, identifying all its fatal diseases: economic dependence on overseas provinces, political instability, military degradation, and most importantly, psychological fatigue and loss of faith in its own invulnerability. And instead of trying to crush this colossus in a frontal assault, he began to methodically and purposefully target its pressure points. He did not storm the fortress, he cut off its oxygen. His strategy was revolutionary for its time. He understood that in the New World, naval supremacy was more important than control of the land. He realized that economic strangulation was more effective than 1,000 swords. He grasped that political chaos in the enemy's capital was a better ally than any army. The sack of Rome was not the cause of its fall, but merely a consequence, a symptom of a death that had already occurred. Gaiseric did not kill Rome. He simply attended the funeral and took the inheritance that no one was left to protect. The paradox of his bloodless victory is that all the blood had been shed long before. In palace conspiracies, in civil wars, in battles between Romans themselves. Gaiseric merely put an elegant end to this process of self-destruction, showing the world that the empire was already dead, even though its body continued to move out of inertia. The story of Gaiseric extends far beyond the biography of a single barbarian king. it is a timeless and universal lesson about the nature of power, about the strength and weakness of civilizations. It teaches us that the most powerful empires and the most impregnable fortresses most often collapse not from an external blow, but from internal decay. They perish from corruption, from a loss of unity, from forgetting the principles that once made them great. The story of Gaiseric is a reminder that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who shouts the loudest and brandishes weapons, but the one who silently studies your weaknesses, who patiently waits for your misstep, who possesses the strategic patience and intelligence to turn your own strengths into vulnerabilities. Gaiseric, the lame bastard, the outcast, was able to defeat Rome because he saw it for what it was, without the illusions and piety that blinded the Romans themselves. He showed that nothing is eternal, especially if you blindly believe in your own eternity. His story is a hymn to asymmetrical strategy, a lesson on how intellect, will, and a deep understanding of the opponent can prevail over superior, but cumbersome and listless forces. And perhaps the main philosophical conclusion of his life is that sometimes, to build something new, you don't need to destroy the old to its foundations, but simply wait for it to collapse on its own, and carefully retrieve from the rubble everything of value to use in building your own new world.